When my nasty coworker gave my cell number to my mother that I was trying to cut out of my life, I spoke before in detail about my mother. Just know she's an extremely awful person I'm glad I have nothing to do with anymore. But this is about Ted, a coworker I used to have when I was in college and working part-time in a warehouse. Unlike me, Ted was a full-time employee, but he didn't act like it. We were about the same age, though. Ted was a snoop. He loved gossip, and he loved to look for things. Ted also spent long periods in the bathroom listening to his MP3 just to avoid working. The first time he got written up was for bringing XXX material to work and reading it out in the open while on break. He called it BS and said our manager was a prude, but no one else sided with him about it. The second time Ted got written up, it was because he gave my cell phone number to my mother. She called my job pretending to be my girlfriend, and Ted gave her the number without question. How did he get it? All employees had their numbers written down by the manager. Most of the employees were part-timers like me, and employee turnover rates were high. So the manager had all our numbers written down at the ready to call someone in to take over a shift when needed, which was surprisingly often. I wouldn't call the manager an unpleasant guy, but he kept everyone at arm's length. Anyway, Ted gave my mother my first cell phone number, and she immediately used it to start calling and harassing me. Oh, he got in trouble for it when I complained to the boss because it was in the rules you're not allowed to give out any personal information of your coworkers. Ted actually blamed the write-up he got for it on me and claimed I should have warned him. I pointed out that if I had a girlfriend, then she'd already have my number. She wouldn't need to ask a stranger for it. Ted gave me attitude and stopped talking with me at all after that. Ted got fired a few months later after being caught snooping in the manager's office again, which he'd been forbidden from entering. He made a big show of yelling, "Screw you, screw this job," when he grabbed his backpack and ran out. I saw him again about a year later in the area working for a landscaping service. I rode by on my bike and slowed down when I saw him working a lawnmower. He didn't seem to recognize me, but I recognized him.
On to the update.
Update to key stealing mill saga. My soon-to-be ex-wife got in contact with my mother that I went no contact from a long time ago. To clarify, since some people didn't know previously, this stuff all happened months ago, which is why I made 3 posts so quickly. After the social media incident, soon-to-be ex-wife tried one last desperate measure to get back at me, which was to track down my mother that I was no contact with. She probably found her through Facebook, because I know my mother has an active page there. My soon-to-be ex-wife knew exactly why I'm no contact with this woman. I told her for years the things my narcissist mother did to me, but she went to see her anyway. Either she was looking for a replacement maternal figure, or she just did it entirely to spite me. Or maybe even both. Either way, we all know she's petty AF. Despite being years North Carolina, my mother wasn't far away. I never really moved far from where I was raised. And my soon-to-be ex-wife fed my mother a very embellished sob story. I got a call from a number I didn't recognize, and it turned out to be my mother. First words out of her mouth were, "How could you?" She wouldn't even give me time to speak by just saying, "I don't want to hear your excuses." Then she went on a rant about the lies soon-to-be ex-wife told her. I just ended the call about halfway through said rant and then blocked the number. I remember thinking to myself at the time, just great. The 2 people I hate most in this world are now banding together. Soon-to-be ex-wife also figured out where I live. I don't know how, but it doesn't really matter anymore. What did matter was she showed up with my goddamn mother. This woman was just as bad as I remembered her, except now she has bleach blonde hair. She's still dressed as if in denial about her age and was still judgmental and narcissistic. But the moment she started yelling at me, I snapped and lost it on her and STBEXW. I started ranting about all the stuff soon-to-be ex-wife and her mother had put me through, and how I wasn't surprised that my own crazy mother would side with a toxic liar like her without even questioning what my half of the story was. I ended up ranting about a whole lot of the stuff that happened, and for once, my mother looked damn scared of me and didn't even try to counter. I don't know how long I was ranting at them. It was just word vomit and yell-splaining to the point I almost mentally checked out while my mouth did the work. But I told my mother all about the things my soon-to-be ex-wife and Mill did to me. About the theft of my collection, about Mill's hoarding and the condition of her house, about how she and soon-to-be ex-wife trapped me in a fake marriage, how soon-to-be ex-wife admitted to trying to baby trap me. and then bringing my own mother over to try and stick it to me. I looked over at soon-to-be ex-wife and said if her big plan was thinking my mother had any power over me, she was even dumber than I thought. And yeah, I ranted about how soon-to-be ex-wife thought my skeleton key collection was worthless. And exactly how and why it wasn't. Police eventually showed up because a neighbor had called them. I had a CCTV camera going inside my apartment watching the door. And it saw enough, so there was video proof I never laid a finger on either of them at least. The police broke things up and escorted soon-to-be ex-wife and mother away. The cops thought I was the bad guy at first. A grown man yelling at two cowering women didn't exactly look good. But they took the time to listen to me, and I showed them the camera footage. My mother looked downright scared of the cops and didn't even want to talk to them. And soon-to-be ex-wife knew exactly what I'd do if she lied to them. So they fessed up as to why they were there, but claimed that giving me a talking to was all they'd intended to do. Right. And Zeus didn't throw lightning. Oh wait, he did. Who knows what those two would have tried, were it not for the police and my temper. No one was arrested, but I made it clear I didn't want my mother or soon-to-be ex-wife coming back. Right after they left, I went to the police station and filled out a report on the incident for a paper trail in case of future stalking. Even though one of the officers tried to tell me that was too much for the situation when all they did was show up at my door. They also seemed to take offense to my making a report against my mother and STBEXW. I told him that he didn't know those people, and they were relentless narcissists. After making the report, I called up my best friend and told him what happened. He asked if I wanted to go riding to clear my head, and I said yes. And we went out bike riding till our legs were numb. The next day I texted my mother from the number she'd called me from and explained some things in detail, and I even sent screenshots of proof I had on some things. I made sure to do all this in text for two reasons. One, so I wouldn't have to actually hear her voice. And two, because I could screenshot all the texts and give them to my lawyer for my divorce case against STBEXW. My mother said soon-to-be ex-wife told her a very different story, that I had been abusive in various ways. I told my mother she was free to have a relationship with STBEXW, but I wanted nothing to do with either of them, and I'll call the police if either of them show up at my apartment or any future one I may be living in ever again. She did not message me back for several days. I also sent messages about what happened to other relatives and asked they be passed around just in case soon-to-be ex-wife went crying to them too, which I guess she was smart enough not to bother doing because none of them heard a peep from her. Soon-to-be ex-wife ended up having a huge fight with my mother, in which my mother kicked her out. My mother finally texted me back and said she wasn't willing to risk staying on STBEXW's side when it meant being dragged into the crossfire. Then she gave me a short sort of apology, which I accepted as good enough, because getting my mother to apologize for anything is like pulling teeth. I stated I still don't want a relationship with her because I know she still defends the way she raised me. She told me she understands and then said to have a nice life somewhat passive-aggressively. Then I reblocked the number. Soon-to-be ex-wife has not yet retained a lawyer for our divorce, then or now. I'm pretty sure she realizes she can't win with all of the evidence I have against her. Every dumb thing she did gave my lawyer more ammunition to work with. She hasn't been fighting back much at all, not that there's anything to fight over. Our formerly shared bank account and rented house were our only joint assets. But I took my name off the account, and we both moved out of the house. My credit is locked down, I have cameras, and I'm taking no BS from her. I think she may be scared of me now. Not long before I started posting again, she'd moved out of the state too. She apparently got a job transfer and notified my lawyer she was leaving and where she was going. But she'll be back whenever she needs to appear in court, so unless something else crazy happens, I won't be needing to update again until after the divorce.
Onto a background post.
Some history on my past and of my nasty mother. TLDR, my mother was a terrible and uninvolved parent, as well as a drunk, a control freak, a thief, and a complete Karen. I had to learn to be independent from a young age, and did whatever I could to survive and avoid her. I dug through trash to find things I needed, and taught myself life skills, recycled bottles and cans for pocket money, and even built an underground fort to hide in. My mother tried to act different towards me in my teens when she realized I didn't need her. I left at 18 and she followed me to try and force me to live with her again. I eventually went no contact and haven't spoken to her in years. Since I've mentioned being no contact with my mother since before meeting wifey, I thought I'd give some history as to why. My mother is a thieving, self-victimizing control freak and a Karen long before people called them that. She makes scenes in public, openly hates animals, repeatedly tried to get meals comped for acting like food or service was terrible, is both a liar and thief, and had a revolving door of boyfriends in her life. And her favorite lines to me were things like, "Life isn't fair. You don't have to like it, you just have to do it. I'm not asking but telling. And does this look like the face of someone who cares?" I think that paints a fairly clear picture. Also, don't think of this as some long sob story. I had a poor but constructive childhood where I learned to make do with what I had. And yes, I apologize for the length. Once I started writing, it opened a floodgate. I'll do my best with a TLDR at the bottom. Growing up, I didn't have a father. Guy died when I was a toddler from an overdose, so my mother raised me. I didn't have any paternal grandparents, and I lost my maternal ones at a young age. They were seemingly good people, so how they had someone as nasty as my mother is beyond me. After they died, I only got occasional familial support from other relatives. And it wasn't much because they didn't like being around my mother. My mother also kept moving us farther away from them. I eventually learned that my mother used me as emotional blackmail to try and make them give her the things she wanted. As a result, I never got close to any of them. Even now, we barely speak. To be fair to my mother in one way, she worked her ass off to keep a roof over our heads at a job that paid minimum wage. But it meant she wasn't around during the day much, and she spent a fair amount of her spare money on booze after covering the bills. She openly told me many times while drunk that she hadn't wanted a child, and she hated being a parent. When she was around, she was most often inebriated and made me do any chore she could think of to get me out of her sight, unless I willingly went outside to do something else. Rain or shine, night or day. I was outside a lot when she was home, even slept outside sometimes. I built forts nearby out of scrap tree limbs and refuse, and those provided some needed fun and shelter on many occasions when I wanted to be away from my mother. At first they were just leaning shelters built against trees, but one day I got a better idea. I'd found a discarded shovel and started digging a hole in the woods near my apartment. I must have spent weeks working on this fort. It was my crowing achievement back then. The hardest part was digging the hole, but I must have gotten it at least 5 feet deep and maybe 8 feet long. I built a roof over it that used a couple of support beams. I used rope and screws to hold it together. Then I covered it over with multiple layers of any discarded plastic and plywood I could find. I confess, though, that this idea was not original to me, as a kid at school told me he and his friend built a similar fort, only they didn't have to make theirs out of trash. I piled the dirt from the excavation on top and made it into a small hill, kind of like a hobbit house. I even planted moss and grass all over it. When inside, I kept picturing myself as Bugs Bunny. The hardest part was hiding the door because I couldn't cover it in leaves while I was inside the fort. I made makeshift ladder to get in and out, and the door covering the entrance was a piece of old plywood I tried to make look as filthy as possible. The fort worked pretty damn well, even kept the rain out. I even had a makeshift bunk to sleep on. I was around 11 when I built this thing, and I told no one about it. But alas, we moved to another apartment about 10 miles away a year later. I went back to my old fort by bike once to check on it after a few months and found an unfriendly homeless guy living in it. I couldn't even get back the stuff I'd hidden there and called it a loss. The next apartment wasn't so close to woods, so I didn't get the chance to build another fort like that. And as a teenager, I managed to get my hands on a tent I used occasionally. Thankfully, as I got a bit older, my mother started not coming back for around 3 days at a time on average, and I had peace. So long as there was food for me to eat and things for me to do, I was fine. From the age of 7 onward, I no longer had babysitters because one of my maternal grandparents had passed around that time, and the other was too sick to help with anything. Both were pretty sick in their final years. I had to get used to being home alone in a stuffy apartment with no AC and not a lot to do when not at school. My mother never had access to a car of her own. We were bus people unless one of her boyfriends gave us a ride. I think from the age of 8, I was essentially taking care of myself, getting myself up for school, making most of my own meals, etc. I pretty much lived off cereal and microwave dinners at home. At school, I qualified for free lunch programs that were for less fortunate families. Yeah, my mother played that system for all it was worth. We always lived in the cheapest apartments in not-so-savory neighborhoods. We never had cable or home internet. So unless hanging out with a friend at their house or going to the library, I could only ever watch public access TV until they cut it from air, or watch one of the few DVDs or VHS we had around. I didn't even have a video game console until a friend's parents gave me their brother's old N64 out of pity. Back at that time, those consoles weren't worth half a damn. So they gave it to me for free, along with some games and an old TV they no longer used, for things to do. I regularly scavenged the garbage in the dumpsters in the apartment complexes around the area for anything I could use or play with. I found clothes, toys, a BMX bike, a radio Walkman, and a few movies on DVD and VHS that way, including some 30th ones, if you get my meaning. I really had to hide those well. Sadly, people mostly only threw out bad movies, so I didn't exactly get to see a lot of blockbusters unless they were unwanted VHS. I surprisingly found a fair amount of Legos. Those really helped keep me entertained. I did find video game cartridges on an occasion, and often sold them to a game store because they were for consoles I didn't have. But I was very lucky to find an N64 game a couple of times. But if I remember right, they were sports games that I didn't find interesting. People threw out books all the time too. But I've never been much of a reader. When my mother found out I was digging in garbage, she didn't even try to stop me. Instead, she told me to grab any aluminum cans or beer bottles I found too, and then recycle them for the deposit money. That became the closest thing I ever had to an allowance. During that time, I also frequented the local dollar store for small things I needed. Any usable clothes I found that fit were just thrown in the wash and worn. I also learned how to sew to mend tears and popped seams in clothes from a young age without help. At school, I could never let on that I had clothes I found in garbage. My friends knew though, and they kept the secret. Funny thing is, people threw out a lot of surprisingly good clothes. I don't know if they were just wasteful or what. Can't tell you how many shirts and pants I found that were just missing a button. I just sewed one on and started wearing them. I didn't care since I had something to wear. But as I got older, I started getting thrift store clothes too. I don't think I ever bought any new clothes till I was in college. I even sewed up holes in socks. I also had to teach myself how to fix a bike. People in the area threw one out at least every few months, and sometimes even just dumped them in a ditch. I found basic tools in the dumpsters from time to time too, so I was able to have a functioning bike that I started riding to school, till some a hole stole it anyway. All because my mother wouldn't let me bring the bike into the apartment. One of my friends later gave me their old bike, along with a length of chain and a padlock to keep it from getting stolen. So I was able to use that bike for a while instead. I was cooking for both myself and my mother, starting around the time I was 9 or 10. She saw me making myself breakfast one morning, and from then on I was cooking for her too. As I got older, I never really cooked anything more elaborate than making spaghetti though. Whenever I went out with my mother, I was expecting her to make a scene in some way. I considered it a good day when all she did was complain. She got us thrown out of places a few times with her entitlement. She often treated strangers like they owed her something, and even pretended she knew things she really didn't, because she could never stand to lose an argument. She was also a blatant thief. On the rare occasion we ate out, she'd take a glass or some silverware from the table and hide it in her purse. And they'd become part of the dishes back home. She regularly swiped little things in stores too. She was clever to grab two of something, and then carefully drop one in her open purse while putting the other back so the CCTV cameras wouldn't notice. My birthdays were generally skipped over by her too. My mother didn't even celebrate her own. She was one of those people who tried to be forever 29 after hitting 30. Since I'd become somewhat self-sufficient, my mother repeatedly told me I was being so productive that she had more money for herself. But strangely enough, as I got older in my teens, she suddenly pulled a 180 and started to act nicer and even tried to infantilize me, which got very creepy. One day when I was around 14, a boyfriend she had at the time dumped her. She was repeatedly trying to cling to me for hours and kept kissing me on the face. She'd never done that before, and it openly disgusted me. Then she started calling me baby all the time, which I eventually had a big fight with her about. She'd gaslight me and call me a bad son, and then I called her a bad mother for never being there for me. She screamed at me to get out. I didn't come back home for 2 days. After that, we had a fight every single time she called me baby, till she finally stopped. I got a part-time job at 15, and my mother demanded for me to use all of my earnings to contribute to the rent and bills. I had to stand up to her once again, but ended up agreeing to give her half. I hardcore saved the rest little by little so I could bolt at 18 and rent out a hovel in order to attend the nearest community college. I packed and left without even telling my mother, but she easily figured out where I went and moved closer to me. She found me on campus and demanded I move back in with her. I refused, and she followed me home. After that, she repeatedly showed up at my place to try and boss me around or intentionally embarrass me in front of my roommates. She even tried to get my college to give her my cell phone number and flipped out when told they can't do that. Then she called my job pretending to be my girlfriend once. That's how she got my first cell phone number. One of my coworkers gave it to her. Oh, he got in trouble for it when I complained to the boss. Because it was in the rules, you're not allowed to give out the personal information of your coworkers. The jerk actually blamed the write-up he got for it on me too. He got fired a few months later. My mother tried to get me fired from that job too. She made numerous calls to complain, but she didn't even know what I did there. So she ended up getting told off by the manager over the phone after I explained my situation to him. I completely cut my toxic mother out of my life when I was around 21 after we had a huge fight because I'd refused to live with her ever again after finishing college. And not being around her helped me to mellow out a lot. While I didn't seek counseling, I've been told many times my mother tried to turn me into what many refer to now as a sans band, a term that creeps me the F out every time I think of it. But the majority I've told this to think my mother started infantilizing me because she suddenly realized she needed me more than I needed her. And I suppose my own past with digging in garbage made me a bit blind to my Mills hoarding issues before I married wifey. And I guess a feeling of needing to have family put me in a very bad fog with my marriage. My personal obsession with skeleton keys started at a fairly young age. My mother took me into an antique store with the boyfriend she had back then. I saw a display with lots of keys for sale in it. The boyfriend offered to get me one, but my mother refused to allow it and told me they were just old junk. I kept wanting one though. I started keeping modern keys I found from time to time, and I got a bunch of can opener keys. You know, the kind that opened cans of Spam. I had a whole ring of them. My mother found the keys and threw them all out. I had to beg her to at least let me keep the can opener keys, which I was barely able to get back. After becoming an adult, I started collecting skeleton keys. At first it was very slow and just keys from a local antique store. But once I was out of college and got a good job, I started buying skeleton keys on eBay, and that's primarily where I bought them since.
Well, that was a lot, wasn't it? What did you think of this post? Did the X cross a line? What do you think of the police trying to dissuade OP from filing a report? Thanks for tuning in today, folks. Come back tomorrow for the final. This is Petty Honest signing off for now. Meow. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe, and all that good stuff. Don't forget to leave your honest thoughts in the comment section below. We love a good juicy thought.